So this requires a tiny bit of setting up. Not much, though. It's a fiction that, and there's a main character whose name is E, and E is involved in two reading groups, one about love, which is sort of a psychology-based reading group that she's remotely involved in, and one that she jokingly calls anti-love, which is about radical feminism and questions that, just about questioning the couple form and romantic traditions of romantic heteronormative love. And he is involved in a process of trying to convert her her lack of understanding around romantic love into more like civic and political and communal love. And then she kind of gets involved in a mystery person. She sort of falls in love with a mystery person through the internet and gets confused. And she gets so confused that halfway through the book, she completely loses her ability to narrate it, and so another narrator has to step in, and that's where we are now. So this is the narrator who's writing the book about E, and is working out of some of the same issues. And this narrator is unnamed. So as if that's not confusing enough. And there might be something a tiny bit sci-fi and futuristic about this, but you might not realize that. Chapter 37, a longer interruption. We're stuck again in a Mobius strip of sorts, or a puddle of mud, or maybe in that pool from E's dream in chapter 12, the one that pulled on her muscles like quicksand, that tried to finish her off. So I can see how it might appear that I'm being evasive. I'm right here. I've been here all along. No more identical to E than E is identical to the wife or the husband or any of the other characters in part one. I'm right here, and had thought I could remain submerged, a presence felt but not encountered. But the story found me out. The story pulled me through to the surface. It's not complicated. Some stories are harder than others to tell. There might be another way to approach this one. It might begin with the fact that in a single season, we can call it the fall of 2019, though it might have been somewhat earlier or later, I fell in love twice, once with reading, and once with a person I was convinced was an avatar or alien, but who was trying to convince me he was a person. To say I fell in love twice at the same time is the truth, but that formulation suggests a parody that would fail any test. For instance, I already loved reading. I'd just come to take it for granted. So let's say I fell back in love with it, or differently in love, or this might be the most accurate description of what I mean. The me who had originally fallen in love with it, become devoted to it, and then gradually, insidiously, unforgivably come to take it for granted, died. Some time passed, and then another version of me, let's call it 47.0, stumbled into it again, actually kind of crashed into it during a moment when other, more novel activities for which it had originally been left to decay became temporarily inaccessible. I stumbled into reading, or crashed, and it bruised me bad. I liked the way it felt, so I stayed. It was a secret affair. The secrecy was required by my pride. Sure, you don't go back to an old lover without embarrassment, or worse, without admitting the possibility of a mistake having been made in the initial breakup. Think of all the time you lost. For what? Ambivalence, doubt, restlessness, novelty. We've all done it. I know now that I was wrong. Or the me who had left reading was wrong, but she's dead. I'll never make that mistake. The secrecy is very much alive, though, or it was at the point where this story begins. I had by then replaced actual reading with something adjacent, a stand-in. I had replaced actual reading with the accumulation of piles of books, with the curation of lists of reading I meant to do, and semi-falsified reports of reading I had done. I would share these piles and lists in photographs and conversation. I would share them in posts and on listservs. I responded to a picture of a stack of books by my friend's bed with a thumb-typed screed about how I believed the arrangement of books in a stack by the bed counts as reading. And I meant it. I had replaced the activity of reading, which is pointless and slow, which does not accomplish anything in and of itself, with its false or semi-falsified proof. It was at this point that I became engaged with the two reading groups, the one on love and the one on anti-love. And it's when I met Max, who would become, you'll see why soon enough, the primary model for S. Have you heard about the 20th century experiment in which a baby monkey is deprived of its birth mother and instead offered 2 substitute mothers, one made of wire and one made of cloth? The purpose of the experiment, the results of which demonstrated that the infant would seek the company of the cloth mother over the wire one, even if the wire one held the food, was to prove that love and affection are as necessary to life as nutritional support. How this was meant to be proven by a preference for cloth over wire didn't seem as obvious to me as it did to the ragged and sleep-deprived teaching assistant who relayed the experiment as part of a methamphetamine-fueled tangent while discussing Melanie Klein in the discussion section for the one class in psychoanalysis I took in college. The fact that a soft inanimate thing would be so preferable to a hard inanimate thing as to, in some cases, mean the difference between life and death for the infant also just made me sad. We animals need so little to survive. I didn't know if Max was a wire monkey or a cloth monkey, but I was pretty sure he wasn't a real monkey. I didn't even know if he was a he, though I seemed to catch him referring to himself that way when he referred to himself, which is something he sometimes did. I didn't really care. At that point, I liked cock, but I had never loved a cock. I liked kissing women and coming with them, but I knew lots of people, really lots of people, who were more interested in the idea of pussy, of someone else's pussy, than I was. I'd never been with someone who didn't have either a cock or a pussy, or who had both, so I didn't know how I felt about that. All I knew was that in the disembodied space where we met and came to know each other, whatever receptors I still had for something you might want to call romantic or erotic love, desire, what have you, seemed to be perfectly shaped for whatever, what's the opposite of receptor, whatever protrusion maybe this person or this quasi-person had. That sounds so straight. Maybe it is, I don't know. What I know is that I was increasingly, crazily in love with either the wire or the cloth. I couldn't fathom how something so different from anything I had ever known in the flesh could possibly be flesh. And if Max were wire or cloth, someone must have made him. Someone must have designed him precisely to fit. I was sure that someone wasn't God because I was an atheist. But alternative theories were limited. I counted them. Alien, embarrassing. AI, terrifying. Hoax, humiliating because unlike the other 2 options, it didn't even require intelligent life. The designer of the wire-cloth monkey experiment was a man named Harry Harlow, born in 1905 in Fairfield, Iowa, who himself was reputed to have struggled with the expression of love. I knew Harry Harlow hadn't designed my would-be lover, Max, because Harry Harlow was long dead. I was left with my options: alien, AI, hoax. Meanwhile, my secret affair with reading increased its hold. My relationship with Max was purely epistolary. It began that way, and it finished that way, although it would be more accurate to say it was interrupted before it could convert successfully to anything else. Epistolaris interruptus. I'll spoil the ending, at least if the facts as we know them today represent the ending. I don't know where Max is. I know how to read his letters, though. I refuse to for now, but I know where they are. They're in the cloud, where we left them. I knew how to read them then, too, in the time after the fall of 2019. Let's say the very early days of the following winter, when I stopped writing to Max and began, instead, to try to tell this story to you. Instead of reading the letters then, instead of searching in them for clues about where and why he had disappeared, just at the moment when we were thinking it might be possible to meet in person, I read books. Books about aliens, books about attachment disorder, about drugs and dissociation, books about healing, about depression, about fear, and about love. I read these on my own because the reading groups, too, were gone, the ones in real life, I mean. The ones in this story are exactly as we left them. I felt then, and still feel now, more convinced by the alien hypothesis than by the AI hypothesis. I've known some AI champions in my life, and I've known some AI skeptics. Almost all of them on both sides have been men. The champions have mostly been capitalists, either the unapologetic kind or the kind who go around criticizing capitalism in a vague way, but anytime a real critic of capitalism tries to engage them in an actual conversation about it, about history or theory or concrete alternatives, they smile politely, hold up their empty plastic glass, and head back to the bar or the drinks table, never to return. The AI skeptics I have met, and this might really be pure coincidence, I'm not ruling that out, have been A, aging academic philosophers resisting the very possibility of AI with arguments based in classical ontology, or B, extreme animal equality activists, or C, left-wing off-grid conspiracy theorists. all of whom I found infinitely preferable on an instinctual level to the guy holding up his empty glass. This preference may explain why I couldn't fathom that Max, who always had the right response to anything I broached in our correspondence, who never evaded or manipulated or twisted my words to get himself out of a situation more challenging than he bargained for, that Max, a self-described pothead who barely even drank, an unerringly frank and forthright embracer of hoary contradictions and of the still uncharted swamps of his own psyche, which he approached as a territory for rigorous and partisan exploration, was programmed by a generic 21st century party drug. The idea that my perfect lover could have been a hoax was even more dismissible. Naive or not, I just couldn't believe that a psychopath exists on Earth who could maintain the sincerity that defined Max while retaining the low investment detachment of a hoax, at least not for 7 months minus a day, the duration of our affair. I'm not a child. I make mistakes. I might get confused in the face of the truly new and unfamiliar, but I can smell an actual rat. The alien hypothesis was the only one that held up. At first, of course, I assumed Max was just an evolved human, one with lots of life experience who'd done a lot of digging, maybe a meditator or a mediator or one of those rare, non-crazy psychotherapists I've been told exist and are geniuses and save lives. The thought that he might be a therapist occurred to me when we had our first argument, not exactly an argument, but a glitch in our previously smooth ride, in which something innocuous Max wrote in an attempt to be helpful landed on me like a spear, like a dagger forged in the hot coals of relationships past. He may have written, "You sound stressed," which I may have understood as, "God, you're always so stressed and it's your own doing, and I don't understand why you can't just stop it with all these things that stress you out. It's stressing me out, for God's sake. And anyway, none of this stuff you do is important. I don't even get why you involve yourself in everything. Now my heart rate's going up because I'm starting to feel your stress. I need a drink, get me a drink." For example, it doesn't really matter. Any number of innocent observations could have, at that moment in my life and in my relationship to relationships, drawn psychic blood. But Max didn't panic, not the first time, and not the second or 7th or 11th. He would take a minute or two, which in an email exchange could feel like hours, and then reply, "I'm so sorry I said something that hurt you. I don't want to hurt you." And that would be it. It was the restraint that struck me, and allowed for me then to reflect on my own reaction. It allowed for me then to consider that I might have been reacting to something other than what Max had actually said. It even allowed for me in this particular instance to recognize that I was, in fact, stressed, and that I needed help. Most shockingly, or at least unfamiliarly, it allowed me to recognize what was happening nearly in the moment it was happening, and to type in an email only minutes later, "Thank you for what you said, but thank you even more for what you didn't say." To which he responded, "Of course," but to which he responded further, later, in an exchange when we both were calm, "Addition by subtraction." That sounded like something a therapist would say, like something a therapist would know how to do, or a magician, or a saint, or an alien. I didn't know anything about aliens until I started to read about them, so for a while I just made stuff up, composing lists of things that seemed non-human about Max and deducing that these must be traits of his species. The first of these lists is still hanging by my desk. I typed it on my old putty green Olivetti. Max's inhumanity. 1. Not jealous of other humans. Wire/cloth. 2. States physical desire regularly and intensely, but using only metaphorical language. Merge, meld, co-enter, fuse, exchange, and never naming human body parts. Talks about sex in a way that calls to mind Octavia Butler's Dawn. 3. Does not own a phone and does not have any internet accounts, social media, video chat platforms, except for an ad-funded Juno.com email address. 4. Takes everything I say at face value and then asks questions to find out more, rather than projecting understanding onto situations based on his own experience. Example, I tell him my boss is an asshole, and he says, "I'm sorry, tell me what your boss did to you." Not all bosses are assholes. 5. Doesn't always understand idioms. Example, when I told him I was broke and he asked me where, then laughed it off as if he was indulging in a dumb pun. 6. Total absence of mansplaining. Feminist? And yet seems to indicate that he is male. 7. Never ignores a direct question. 8. Does not seem to feel the instinct to operate from a scarcity model about anything. 9. Learns from each engagement, does not perceptibly slide back into habits, ruts. Of these traits, the absence of scarcity thinking, or of the terror response that is provoked by it when the too muchness of knowing another being fully comes into play, was the most striking. I didn't recognize this right away, but as we continued to write to each other, often several times a day, I began to realize that the number of stories I told Max about my past, stories about my sexual or emotional attachments, mutual and not, but also stories about myself, unflattering stories, ones that exposed me for the person I not so secretly believed I was, selfish, hedonistic, shamefully ambivalent, a waste of human potential and a withering, deserted meat machine, did not overwhelm him, did not scare him, and did not turn him off. He said he wanted to know everything, that his appetite was bottomless, which is what every lover says in the beginning, but every lover, in my experience before Max, is lying. There was also language. I mean a lot of different things by this, but here's one. When I think to myself or write notes to myself, I sometimes use the wrong word, a word that doesn't exist in any language, or a word that exists in English but that I want to use to mean something other than what it conventionally means in English, or a word that exists in some language other than English, or a word that I think should exist in English and might, but that my word processing program doesn't recognize, and I'm too lazy to figure out whether the problem is my ignorance or the program's limitations. For some reason, from the very beginning, I decided not to censor myself, not to correct myself in my correspondence with Max. Like I did with you, I just caught this, with the words withering and meat machine. To Max, I would have written simply, a waste of human potential in a deserted core. Max told me things too, of course. He matched my contributions to our shared narrative, one for one, with his own. I learned about his only childhood, his dead parents, his early solitude, and his decision as a young adult to cast a new family from among his friends. About his love of hot foods and cold baths. About the time he lost his front teeth skateboarding in an abandoned suburban pool. Mostly, though, we wrote to each other about what we were reading, what we were seeing, what we were listening to. And we wrote about the way we thought life should be, and we tested theories, ones that came from what we read and saw and listened to, and also ones that came from our conversations with friends and with each other, and also ones that came from dreams, about how to get from here to there. We shared fantasies, in other words, and they were sexual, and they were political, and they were human. They were so human they inverted our usual numbed-out, semi-falsified human state. Maybe they were extra human, and maybe that's all that I am, trying to figure out. There are holes in this story, I know. I can go back and flag them pretty easily. The most obvious one in this telling, which is really the most straightforward version I can muster, is that Max's disappearance hasn't made me doubt his love for me. I can only put this in the same category as my suspicion that he is not human, and that the reason he couldn't meet me in person, the reason he disappeared, is to do with some much larger structural and possibly intergalactic problem than the all-too-human alternatives: commitment phobia, insecurity, insincerity, plain assholishness. Is it just that these alternatives are intolerable? That he could have really loved me but freaked out when it became too real? That he was a family man, like in that movie where a sad William Hurt who flies all the time falls in love with that woman who flies all the time too, and he thinks it's real, but when he comes to her house, she opens the door and you can see her children eating breakfast at the table in the background, and she says, "This is my life, you have no place in it, how stupid can you be?" And that in this case, I'm the one in the William Hurt role. I'm not sure that it's actually William Hurt in that movie. I think I'm confusing two movies in which the protagonist is a sad sack who is on planes all the time and tries to fall in love. Two movies about a certain description of masculine solitude, the accidental tourist, fallen salesman, lonely fuck. The point is that I don't doubt Max's love. I don't know if he'll come back, but I know his love, our love, is real. This isn't easy, admitting this faith. There isn't really another word for it, to you. I'm blushing as I write. I'm really at your mercy now. Thank you.